At my granddaughter's custody hearing, my son-in-law's lawyer looked at the judge and said, "My client's mother-in-law is a relegated auxiliary nurse with a history of disappearing. She is unfit." And my son-in-law nodded proudly. "Even she didn't attend her daughter's funeral," he continued, as if my grief were proof of guilt. As if the way I collapsed at her graveside, unable to speak for 3 days, unable to eat for a week, meant I was somehow less of a mother, less of a grandmother, less than human. "Judge," the bailiff interrupted. "There's a man from the State Department here. Before we go on, please like this video, subscribe to Elderly Bloodline Secrets, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about justice. And everything I thought I knew about the man who married my daughter. They called me unfit. Unfit. Do you know what that word does to a woman who's spent 40 years of her life caring for others? 40 years of 12-hour shifts, of holding dying hands, of bringing people back from the edge when everyone else had given up? I was the nurse who stayed late when families couldn't afford private care. I was the one who sang lullabies to premature babies whose mothers were too terrified to touch them. I was the woman who worked double shifts to put my daughter through college, who held her hair back when she was sick, who taught her to drive, to love, to be strong. And when she died, when she died, I buried her with these same hands that once brought others back to life. These hands that had delivered babies, that had closed the eyes of the peaceful dead, that had comforted thousands of grieving families. But no one came for me. Not even him, the husband who now calls me unstable. The man who couldn't even look at me during the funeral, who stood on the opposite side of her grave like I was some kind of disease he might catch. You want to know about disappearing? I disappeared into my grief. I disappeared into the bottles of her perfume I kept unopened because the scent was all I had left. I disappeared into the photos where she was still alive, still laughing, still calling me every Sunday to tell me about her day. I disappeared because the world became unbearable without her voice in it. But James saw opportunity in my grief. James saw weakness where there was only devastation. James, charming, polite James, who everyone loved, who brought flowers to church socials and remembered everyone's birthdays. James who was so concerned about little Emma's well-being, so worried about her unstable grandmother who might corrupt her with too much love, too much memory of her mother. He remarried 6 months after my daughter died. 6 months. I was still finding her hair in my shower drain, and he was already planning a new life with a woman who looked nothing like my daughter. A woman who smiled too much and spoke in baby talk to Emma, like she was simple. A woman who threw away my daughter's things while I was visiting Emma, claiming she was helping the family move forward. Move forward. As if my daughter was just some obstacle to overcome, some unfortunate chapter to close and forget. He said I was too fragile, that I lived in the past. But the past was where his secrets lived. The past was where the truth was buried deeper than my daughter's body. I started hearing whispers at the grocery store, at church, in the pharmacy where I picked up my sleeping pills. Whispers about insurance money that came through faster than anyone expected. Whispers about paperwork that seemed too convenient, too clean. Whispers about a man who grieved just long enough to look respectable before moving on to his new life. But I never confronted him directly. Oh no. 40 years of nursing taught me patience. 40 years of watching people lie about their symptoms, their addictions, their pain, taught me how to observe without being observed. I was gathering proof while he thought I was falling apart. And maybe I was falling apart. Maybe grief was eating me alive from the inside out. But grief doesn't make you stupid. Grief doesn't make you blind. If anything, grief gave me clarity, stripped away all the politeness and social niceties that keep us from seeing the truth about people. You see, they said I vanished, that I had a history of disappearing. They weren't entirely wrong. Before nursing, before marriage, before my daughter was even born, I worked as a volunteer field medic for international missions. The kind that never made the news. The kind where you learn that governments have long memories and longer reach. I had contacts still in intelligence, people who remembered my service, people who owed me favors from when I patched them up in places that never appeared on a map. I was 22 when I first disappeared into a jungle in Central America, carrying medical supplies to villages that didn't exist on any official chart. The organization called itself Doctors Without Borders, but we all knew there was more to it than that. We knew because the men who protected us carried weapons that weren't standard issue for any military I'd ever heard of, and because sometimes we'd treat patients who spoke perfect English, but claimed to be local farmers. I was 24 when I treated gunshot wounds in a refugee camp that 3 different governments denied existed. The camp was hidden in the mountains between 2 countries that were officially at peace, but unofficially trying to kill each other through proxy wars. We worked by candlelight most nights because generators made too much noise. We used fishing line for sutures when we ran out of proper thread. We learned to distinguish between the sounds of different aircraft engines because some meant supplies and some meant bombs. I was 26 when I held the hand of a dying CIA operative who made me promise to never tell anyone his real name. He'd been shot during what was supposed to be a simple intelligence gathering mission that had gone sideways when someone betrayed the team's location. He died telling me about his daughter back home in Kansas, about how she was starting kindergarten and he was going to miss it. I promised him I'd send her a birthday card every year, and I kept that promise for 23 years until cancer took her too. They said I vanished. But I was saving lives in places where saving lives was considered treason by some and heroism by others. I learned to speak 4 languages fluently and understand fragments of 6 more. I learned to identify different types of ammunition by the wounds they left. I learned that sometimes the greatest mercy you can offer someone is a lie about how bad their injuries really are. And I learned that there are people in this world who remember favors, who keep track of debts, who understand that sometimes justice requires intervention from places the average person never thinks about. I met Thomas during my 3rd year in the field. He was officially listed as a cultural attaché to the embassy, but cultural attaches don't usually carry Glock pistols or know how to disable improvised explosive devices. He'd been wounded during an attack on a village where we were running a vaccination clinic. Shrapnel from a grenade had torn through his left shoulder and nicked an artery. I spent 3 hours keeping him alive while we waited for extraction, holding pressure on the wound and feeding him a steady stream of lies about how everything was going to be fine. He lived, obviously, made a full recovery, and went on to have a distinguished career in what we euphemistically called diplomatic services. But he never forgot those 3 hours. Never forgot the nurse who kept him conscious by telling him stories about her plans to go to nursing school when she got back to the States, about the daughter she wanted to have someday, about the quiet life she was going to build far away from bullets and blood. When I finally did come home, when I traded jungle medicine for hospital corridors, when I married David and we had Sarah, I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever. I thought I could just be a normal nurse in a normal hospital in a normal American city. And for the most part, I was right. I delivered babies and comforted the dying and worked my way up from auxiliary nurse to charge nurse to supervisor. I raised my daughter and attended PTA meetings and baked cookies for school fundraisers. But Thomas kept in touch. Christmas cards at first, then occasional phone calls when his work brought him through town. We'd have coffee and carefully not talk about the old days, instead discussing Sarah's soccer games and his son's college applications. He became just another family friend, another face at Sarah's graduation, another voice offering condolences when David died of his heart attack. So when I reached out to Thomas after Sarah's death, when I told him about James and the insurance money and the way my access to Emma was being systematically cut off, he listened. Really listened. Not the way people listen to grieving grandmothers, with that patronizing patience that means they're just waiting for you to finish talking. He listened the way he used to listen when I was telling him about enemy troop movements or the location of improvised medical facilities. He asked detailed questions. He wanted to know about the timeline of Sarah's illness, about the insurance policies, about James's behavior in the weeks before and after her death. He wanted copies of every document I could get my hands on. He wanted the names of doctors and lawyers and insurance agents. He promised to help discreetly. He promised to look into things. And Thomas always kept his promises. But the investigation took time. Months of careful work, of following paper trails and interviewing witnesses and building a case that would hold up in federal court. Meanwhile, James was moving fast. He filed for full custody just 3 months after Sarah died, claiming I was having a mental breakdown and posed a danger to Emma's well-being. His evidence was carefully constructed and devastatingly effective. He had statements from neighbors claiming I'd been behaving erratically. He had medical records showing I'd been prescribed antidepressants and sleeping pills. He had photos of my house in disarray, taken during a period when I could barely get out of bed, let alone clean. He had recordings of phone conversations where I sounded confused and rambling, conversations I didn't even remember having. Most damaging of all, he had testimony about my failure to attend Sarah's funeral. What he didn't mention was that I'd collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration the night before. What he didn't mention was that I'd spent the previous week planning every detail of the service, while he was supposedly too grief-stricken to help. What he didn't mention was that the doctor had sedated me because I was having panic attacks so severe I couldn't breathe. But James's version was cleaner, simpler. His version painted him as the responsible father protecting his daughter from an unstable grandmother who lived in the past and couldn't face reality. And everyone believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was young, successful, remarried to a nice woman who clearly adored Emma. I was just a bitter old woman who couldn't let go of her dead daughter. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November. I spent the weekend before trying on different outfits, trying to find something that would make me look stable and confident instead of crazy and desperate. I practiced answering questions in the mirror, trying to keep my voice steady when I talked about Sarah, trying not to cry when I explained why Emma needed to know about her mother. James's lawyer was a shark in an expensive suit who specialized in character assassination. He started by painting a picture of my allegedly troubled past, my unexplained absences during the early years of Sarah's life, my pattern of disappearing when things got difficult. He made my service overseas sound like abandonment, my grief sound like mental illness, my love for Emma sound like obsession. Then he brought up the funeral. He described my absence in excruciating detail, how James had to handle all the arrangements alone while I was nowhere to be found. How little Emma had asked for her grandmother during the service, and no one could explain where I was. How my own daughter was laid to rest without her mother there to say goodbye. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone in that courtroom about the sleepless nights I'd spent at Sarah's bedside during her childhood illnesses. About the sacrifices I'd made to pay for her education. About the way she'd called me her best friend and meant it. About how James had barely spoken to me during her illness, how he'd seemed more concerned with her insurance paperwork than her pain. But my lawyer had coached me to stay quiet, to let him handle the defense. He was a good man, competent and caring, but he was fighting with conventional weapons against an opponent who was willing to use anything. The son-in-law's lawyer finished his character assassination with flourish, painting me as a mentally unstable woman who had abandoned her own daughter's funeral, who lived in fantasies about the past, who posed a clear danger to young Emma's emotional development. The judge seemed convinced. I could see it in his face, the way he was already forming his decision, already preparing to hand my granddaughter over to a man who had married her mother for money and was now trying to erase every trace of her existence. And then the bailiff returned with that man in the crisp suit. I recognized the walk before I recognized the face. 20 years had added gray to his hair and lines around his eyes, but Thomas still moved with the same quiet confidence that had gotten us both out of more dangerous situations than I cared to remember. He walked straight to the judge, no hesitation, no deference to the ongoing proceedings. just walked up like he owned the place and handed over a sealed folder. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even James's lawyer stopped mid-sentence, mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to be loud to command attention. "This pertains to an ongoing federal matter involving Mr. Rowan's financial activity." I watched James's face go white. Not pale, not flushed, but actually white, like someone had drained all the blood out of his body. His new wife reached for his hand, and he jerked away from her like her touch burned him. The judge read silently, and I could see his expression change with every line. His eyebrows rose, then furrowed, then rose again. His mouth tightened into a thin line. His hands, which had been steady throughout the entire hearing, started to shake slightly as he turned the pages. "Mr. Rowan," the judge said finally, his voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "You're under investigation for falsifying life insurance documents under your late wife's name." The sound that came from that courtroom wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a scream. It was the sound of 30 people all having the air knocked out of them at exactly the same moment. It was the sound of a lie so big, so audacious, finally colliding with the truth. James turned to look at me then, really look at me for the first time since Sarah's funeral. And in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine, bone-deep terror. Because he was finally realizing that the crazy old woman he had been so casually destroying might not be as powerless as he thought. His lawyer was on his feet, sputtering objections and demanding explanations, but Thomas just stood there calmly, like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. Like he knew exactly how this was going to end. "The investigation," Thomas continued, speaking directly to the judge and ignoring the chaos erupting around him, indicates that Mr. Rowan filed multiple claims under false pretenses, including backdating a policy increase just weeks before his wife's death. There are also questions about medical records that were submitted as evidence of her declining health, records that appear to have been altered. I felt something break open inside my chest then, but it wasn't grief this time. It was vindication. It was the satisfaction of knowing that my daughter hadn't just died, she had been killed. Not with a gun or a knife, but with paperwork and false documents and the kind of slow, careful murder that happens in offices and insurance companies and lawyers' meetings. Thomas continued reading from his report, his voice never wavering, never showing emotion. Mrs. Sarah Rowan was reportedly suffering from a rare autoimmune condition that required expensive treatment. However, medical records from her primary physician show no evidence of this condition. The records submitted to the insurance company appear to have been fabricated using stolen letterhead and forged signatures. Furthermore, Mr. Rowan increased his wife's life insurance coverage by 400% just 6 weeks before her death, claiming it was necessary due to her deteriorating health. He also added a rider for accidental death, despite his wife having no history of risky behavior or dangerous activities. The investigation has also revealed that Mrs. Rowan's death certificate was amended twice after the initial filing. The cause of death was changed from natural causes to complications from autoimmune disease, then changed again to include a notation about pre-existing conditions that do not appear in any of her actual medical records. I thought about Sarah then, about her last weeks when she complained of feeling tired all the time but couldn't understand why. About how James kept bringing her vitamins and supplements that he claimed would help with her energy. About how she mentioned feeling confused and forgetful, symptoms that didn't match any illness her doctors could identify. I thought about the night she died, how James called me hysterical, claiming he'd found her collapsed in their bedroom. How the paramedics said there was nothing they could do, that she'd been dead for hours. How James seemed to know exactly which funeral home to call, which lawyer to contact, which insurance agent to notify. Thomas was still talking, still laying out the evidence that would destroy James's life. Bank records showing large cash deposits in the weeks following Sarah's death. Communications with insurance agents that contradicted James's sworn statements. Testimony from a private investigator who James had hired to research his wife's family medical history, looking for any hereditary conditions that might explain a sudden death. But I didn't need to hear any more. I already knew what Thomas had found because I'd suspected it all along. Sarah hadn't died of natural causes. She'd been poisoned slowly, carefully, by a man who saw her death as a business opportunity. A man who had probably started planning her murder the day he realized she was worth more dead than alive. The judge ordered a recess. James was escorted out by 2 federal marshals who had apparently been waiting outside the entire time. His new wife was crying, not the pretty tears of grief, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose entire life had just collapsed around her. She probably hadn't known. She was probably just another victim of James's charm, another woman who thought she'd found the perfect husband without realizing she'd married a killer. And through it all, I just sat there, thinking about my daughter. Thinking about how she used to complain that James never wanted to talk about money, never wanted to discuss life insurance or wills or any of the practical things that married couples should discuss. Thinking about how she mentioned, just once, that he had been asking her to sign some papers, but wouldn't really explain what they were for. Thinking about how she died of what the doctors called natural causes, even though she was only 32 and had never been sick a day in her life. When the hearing resumed, everything had changed. James's lawyer was gone, replaced by a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. The man from the State Department was gone too, but his presence lingered in the room like smoke. The judge ruled for my custody of Emma without hesitation. Full custody, with James getting supervised visitation pending the outcome of his federal case. He wouldn't even look at me when the ruling was read. Just stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. As I walked out of that courtroom, I caught sight of him one last time. He was handcuffed, being led away by those federal marshals, and for just a moment, our eyes met. I leaned close enough that only he could hear me, and I whispered, "You called me unfit, but I was the one keeping your sins from destroying her." He tried to say something back, but the marshals kept walking, and his words were lost in the echo of the hallway. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Federal prosecutors painted James as a calculating killer who had murdered his wife for insurance money, then tried to steal her child from the only family she had left. They presented evidence of premeditation going back months before Sarah's death. They showed how he'd researched untraceable poisons, how he'd practiced forging medical documents, how he'd even taken out a separate life insurance policy on Sarah without her knowledge. The defense tried to paint him as a grieving husband who had made some poor financial decisions, but was certainly not a murderer. They claimed the insurance fraud was just paperwork errors, that the suspicious timing was just coincidence, that Sarah's death was tragic but not criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hair samples that showed traces of heavy metals consistent with slow poisoning. Computer records showing James had researched symptoms and treatment for various toxins. Bank records showing he'd made several large purchases of chemicals that could be used to manufacture poison. Phone records showing he'd contacted multiple insurance companies in the weeks before Sarah's death, shopping for the best policies and asking detailed questions about payout procedures. Most damning of all, they found Sarah's journal. She'd been writing in it regularly during her final months, documenting her declining health and her growing suspicion that something was wrong. She wrote about feeling sick after meals that James had prepared. She wrote about finding strange bottles in their medicine cabinet that James claimed were vitamins. She wrote about overhearing phone conversations where James was discussing insurance policies she'd never heard of. In her final entry, written just 2 days before her death, she wrote, "I think James is trying to kill me. I think he's been poisoning me for months. I don't know what to do. I'm scared to confront him because I don't know how far he'll go. I'm scared to call the police because I don't have proof. I'm scared to tell Mom because I don't want to worry her. But if something happens to me, if I die suddenly, please know that it wasn't natural. Please know that Emma needs to be protected from him." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found James guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, insurance fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I was there for the sentencing. I sat in the front row, holding Emma's hand, watching as the man who had killed my daughter was led away in shackles. He looked older than his 34 years, defeated and broken. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood up slowly and turned to look at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for what I did to Sarah. I'm sorry for what I put Emma through. I'm sorry for trying to take her away from you. You were right all along. You were the only one who really loved them both." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't erase the months of grief and fear and legal battles. Sorry doesn't give Emma back her mother or give me back my daughter. But justice, real justice, finally felt complete. Emma is 7 years old now. She lives with me in the house where her mother grew up, sleeping in the same bedroom where Sarah once dreamed about her future. She's smart and funny and stubborn, just like her mother was. She asks about Sarah sometimes, and I tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways. I tell her that her mother was a good person who was hurt by someone who was supposed to love her. I tell her that sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that doesn't mean we stop being good. She doesn't remember much about James, which is probably for the best. Sometimes she asks why her father lives in the place where bad people go, and I tell her that he made some very serious mistakes and now he has to think about what he did wrong. She seems to accept this explanation, though I know someday I'll have to tell her the full truth. For now, she's just a little girl who loves her grandmother and feels safe in a house full of love and memories. She plays in the same backyard where her mother once built fairy houses out of twigs and leaves. She sleeps under the same stars that her mother once wished on. She carries the same stubborn streak and bright smile that made Sarah such a joy to raise. And every night, when I tuck her into bed and she asks about her mommy, I tell her stories. I tell her about the day Sarah was born, how she came into the world hollering and never really stopped making noise. I tell her about Sarah's first steps, her first words, her first day of school. I tell her about how Sarah used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms, how she once tried to give our cat a bath and ended up soaked herself, how she always insisted on wearing mismatched socks because she said matching was boring. I tell her about Sarah's college graduation, how proud I was watching her walk across that stage. I tell her about the day Sarah met James, how happy she seemed, how she called me that night to tell me she thought she'd found the one. I tell her about Sarah's wedding day, how beautiful she looked in her dress, how she cried during the vows because she was so happy. And then I tell her about the day Emma was born, how Sarah called me from the hospital at 3 a.m, crying with joy and exhaustion and pure love. How Sarah said that becoming a mother was the best thing that had ever happened to her, that holding Emma for the first time felt like coming home. I don't tell her about the poison or the trial, or the way her father destroyed all our lives for money. I don't tell her about the months of grief and rage and helplessness that nearly broke me. I don't tell her about the nights I spent planning my own revenge, about the dark thoughts that consumed me when I thought justice would never come. Instead, I tell her about love. I tell her that her mother loved her more than anything in the world. I tell her that she was wanted and cherished and celebrated from the moment she was conceived. I tell her that even though her mother isn't here anymore, that love still surrounds her every day. Justice doesn't always arrive in handcuffs. Sometimes it walks in quietly wearing a gray suit. Sometimes it comes from phone calls made to old friends who remember when you saved their lives in places that don't exist on maps. Sometimes it comes from the patient work of building a case, one small piece of evidence at a time, while everyone thinks you're just a crazy old woman lost in her grief. If you believe truth always finds its way, type justice wins in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to Elderly Bloodline Secrets, and tell me, what would you have done if you were me? What would you have done if someone tried to steal the last piece of your heart while painting you as the villain in your own story? I didn't need revenge. I only needed peace. And now, with Emma safe in my arms, with the truth finally spoken in a court of law, with James facing the consequences of what he did to my daughter, I finally have that peace. But some nights, when I'm tucking Emma into bed and she asks about her mommy, I tell her the truth. I tell her that her mommy was murdered by a man who was supposed to love her, but that justice has a long memory and an even longer reach. I tell her that sometimes the good guys really do win, even when it takes them a while to show up. And I tell her that her grandmother isn't crazy or unfit or unstable. Her grandmother is just someone who knows how to fight back when fighting back seems impossible. Her grandmother is someone who learned a long time ago that disappearing doesn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it means regrouping. Sometimes it means calling in old debts. Sometimes it means waiting patiently for the perfect moment to remind the world that underestimating a grieving woman is the kind of mistake that can destroy your entire life. James thought he was clever. He thought he had it all figured out. He thought he could murder my daughter with paperwork and insurance fraud, then steal her child and paint me as the unstable one. He thought wrong. And now he'll have plenty of time in federal prison to think about just how wrong he was. Plenty of time to think about the nurse he underestimated, the grandmother he tried to destroy, the woman whose past he never bothered to investigate. Plenty of time to think about the fact that some disappearances are strategic retreats and some old women have friends in very dangerous places.